Father, how would you handle the objection? I get this one a lot. I say, find yourself a traditional Latin Mass. Go, go, go. Even if you drive 30 minutes, make it happen. People say, well, the Novus Ordo is valid, so let's just go with that. And then,
Oh,
Father Dave Nick says, it's like someone saying, how's your marriage going? And you say, well, it's valid. Um, how do you respond? Because you said something just then that I think some people would object to about the traditional Latin Mass being more meritorious, and then they're going to say, well, if it's the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ in the Eucharistic
right.
species, how could you say something like that? So, can you kind of bring a little bit of a scholastic unpacking of what you meant there?
Yeah. So if you actually look at the article which I wrote on the merit of the Mass, there's 6 areas of merit. It is true that in 5 of those areas, the new Mass and the old Mass are the same, as far as for example. So it is true that it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity. It is the participation in the Calvary sacrifice, an atemporal participation. So it is that. And so in that sense, both rites are equal as to the infinite value or merit that Christ's sacrifice had. But the authors prior to the council, in a lot of the discussion, talked about the fact that that infinite merit of Christ's Calvary sacrifice has not been applied completely yet. This is actually one of the reasons why St. Paul says, I make up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, right? There's things that we have to do so that the merits of Christ on the cross can be applied concretely in our own life. Well, they say that the effects of the liturgy are not infinite. It is true that the priest in consecrating the host, Christ there, and he's infinite, etc. But the actual application of the Calvary sacrifice through the Mass in the concrete, they said, is intensively limited. That's the phrase they use, intensively limited, which means that the application of the merits of Christ's sacrifice actually come through our actions. The devotion of the people at the Mass, the devotion of the priest at the Mass, the actual Mass itself. So what it's asking for is going to determine its effects. The sacrality of it, as I just mentioned, and all of that determines the actual application of the Calvary sacrifice in the concrete. And we know this to be true just by virtue of the fact that if Christ's Calvary sacrifice, if the merits were not restricted in their application, everything would be perfect already.
Yeah, everyone would be saved.
Everyone would be saved.
Yep.
Everyone would be perfect. There would be no sin. There'd be
Right.
no evils, no nothing. And this is why they actually talk about that the full effects or the full merits of Christ's passion will be applied at the final judgment. So that's when it's actually, and at the resurrection, that's when it's going to be applied. But in the meantime, it's restricted in how much the application actually occurs, and that's why I think it's very important for people to realize that our actions, how the priest says Mass, etc., determines the grace, the effects, the spiritual benefits that the people get from it. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people will go to the old Mass and they'll notice a significant change in their spiritual life. The priests themselves, when they start saying it, notice a significant change in their spiritual life. A lot of graces, things they would struggle with interiorly, get cleaned up quite a bit more easily, etc. Because the graces, I think, are being more applied because they're being asked for in the liturgy.
Yeah. And when I hear this objection, it's in person, I say, well, a consecration is a consecration. The bread and
Right.
wine transubstantiate into the body and blood of Christ. But I say to them, I said, would you prefer to be at the Mass of Padre Pio or at a Mass where a priest has cloudy theology and is in a state of mortal sin?
Right. Exactly.
And everyone knows the answer to that question. And that
Yeah.
kind of reveals the distinctions that you're making here.
Yeah, and lay people have an intuition, or an intuitive sense, or a sensus catholicus, or a sensus fidelium about this, because they know that when they want a Mass said for something important, they're going to try and find the most holy priest or the priest who's going to say the best Mass. They just look for him.
Right, right.
And so so they know this intuitively. And I think that it's kind of funny because, before I wrote that article, For 3 decades, all I heard was the new Mass is better than the old, new Mass is better than the old, new Mass is better than the old. That's all we heard, right? And so I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. What's contained in that assertion is that one rite can be, objectively speaking, greater than another. Okay, if that's true, let's sit down and look at the rites and give this an honest, objective analysis. Well, then, as soon as I put that article out, within 2 years, that whole type of discussion, at least around me, stopped, and it all just said they're equal.
Yeah, that's the new one.
Because that's their new defense, because they're trying to go back to the fact that it's true, it's valid, and so therefore it's equal on that level, but it's not equal in the application of its merits because of the fact that what we're doing, our actions determine what we merit, and that's the key aspect to it.
Okay, so Father, what if someone watching says, well, I don't know. Father Ripperger sounds like a Donatist. He's saying it's all up to the minister, to the priest on the altar. I thought it was all ex opere operato. What distinctions do you bring to explain that objection?
Well, the ex opere operato is in the confection of the Eucharist. It's in the actual consecration of the species. But then the applications of the merit are ex opere operantes. That is, the other. So the basic areas are the sanctity of the priest as public minister of the church. So a bishop's mass, technically speaking, is going to be more meritorious on an objective level than a priest's mass, all other things being equal. Then the sanctity of the priest as the part they call it. So there's the public part of the minister. That's whether he's a bishop or a priest. Then there's the private aspect. That's how holy he is. So how holy he is going to merit more than others. Then it's the sanctity of the people that are actually present. Then the next one is the actual ritual of the Mass. What you ask for is what you're going to get. And this principle that liturgy, or that the prayer begets what it signifies. And we know this straight from Scripture. Christ said, knock and it will be opened. He didn't say, knock and I'm going to give you a flower. He said, knock and it will be opened. And so he's making a correspondence between what we ask for is what we're going to get. And so, but that principle is getting denied more and more and more as we go on, because if we really apply that across the board, it's going to be pretty ugly, because a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the church in the last 30 to 40 years. And also then it becomes more uncomfortable, because then people are going to have to start changing their lives, etc. But then the last one is what I call the pomps. Those are the pomp. That's the external stuff. The external things, so having beautiful chalices, vestments, if you say it in a beautiful church. You can also have what we call relative value in that respect. So, for example, you might have a simpler church, but the sacrifice of the people just to get that built is much more extreme. Even though it has a certain decorum, it may not be sharp, but at least it's it has a certain beauty and a decorum, and so God will take. Will apply the merits more efficaciously in those cases because of the sacrifices of the people. But the point being, so those are the externals in relationship to it. And all these go in to determine the actual merit of a particular Mass.
Yeah, I think, like you said, the lay people intuit that, but there's a lot of these so-called experts online who, like you said, are trying to say it's all equal, it's all the same. But I think people down in their gut know that it's not. And you read the lives of the saints, you read church history, and you realize that the miraculous things that are happening in the outpouring through the sacraments, especially in the Mass, are related to the sanctity of certain saints, either participating in Mass or actually celebrating Mass. It's there in our tradition. You can't deny it.
That's right. That's correct. And, in addition to, experts, people, well, as you know, everybody just puts out a shingle, and they think they start a podcast and they think they're an expert in something. And it's funny because I recently learned a new word. I'm always trying to increase my vocabulary. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the word ultra-crepidarian.
No.
It's somebody who insists on weighing in on something they know nothing about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing an awful lot of that online these days. We're seeing an awful lot of it where, some of the criticisms that have been leveled against me, which I actually must admit I get more entertainment value out of my detractors than I actually do anything else. But and sometimes it actually is good, because then it helps me say I need to clarify this a little bit here and there. But what I'm finding is that, and this is part of the problem of modernism ultimately, and the Protestant Revolution, but modernism, where the objective for truth is transposed from objective reality to the interior. So people feel certain things, and so as a result of that, they become an expert on them, and they can think they can wax poetically about it, so to speak, or wax eloquently. But in the end, it lacks any kind of theological precision.
Yeah. Well, and that is modernism, that the feelings, the emotion, the reception of a person is what defines liturgy and dogma. And that's right. If you accept that premise, that means that liturgy and dogma must be revised every 5 to 10 to 15 years.
15 years.
Correspond to the experience of the recipients. I thought it was interesting just yesterday.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, and actually that very idea, which is in the church today, is highly ironic, because we're living in a church now where the liturgy is from the 60s. The Mass is from the 60s. The vestments are from the 60s. The music is from the 60s. These old duffers that are still saying the old Mass still have a 60s mentality and still preach like they're in the 60s. The churches look like they're from the 60s. If that principle was actually true, the church would ultimately be remaking itself every so many years, but that's not what's happened. What's happening is these guys got stuck at a specific time in their life, emotionally and psychologically, and developed, and they haven't gotten beyond it. That in point in fact, at a certain point, I mean, everybody kind of goes through a stage, especially when they get into young adulthood, where they have to make a certain set of decisions and to continue growing emotionally, et cetera, and psychologically in virtue. And that requires suffering, but that generation didn't do that, and they got stagnated in the 60s. And so even their liturgy, you kind of see that even in relationship to some of the stuff coming out of the magisterium, even the forms of expression are still from the 60s. And you're just like, can we get beyond this is the question you want to ask.